When a desperate woman rides onto a broken-down ranch and asks a lonely stranger to marry her, not out of love, but out of survival, one quiet man decides to take on the most dangerous person in the county. What happens next will shock an entire town into silence, then wake them up forever. If you've ever been told you don't matter, that you're too quiet, too ordinary, too forgettable to make a difference, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Vivian Mercer rode onto Elias Boone's property, the sky looked the way it always did in late October. Heavy and gray and undecided, like it couldn't make up its mind whether to storm or just threaten to. The kind of sky that made a man feel small without quite knowing why. Elias was crouched behind the barn, working a rusted bolt loose from a fence post that had been rotting since spring. He had a coffee can of grease beside him, a pair of pliers that were 2 sizes too small for the job, and his left knee was throbbing the way it always did when the weather was about to turn. He wasn't thinking about much of anything. That was usually how his mornings went, slow, physical, quiet. Just him and the livestock and the sound of wind moving through dried grass. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw her, not the casual clop of someone passing on the road. These were purposeful, direct, coming up his drive like the rider knew exactly where she was going and intended to get there fast. Elias set down his pliers and stood up slowly, pressing one hand against the small of his back. At 41, his body had opinions about crouching that it hadn't had at 30. He came around the side of the barn just as she pulled up. She rode a dark bay mare with a white streak down her nose. Good horse, well kept, the kind of animal that cost real money. The woman in the saddle wore a dark riding coat over a practical dress. No nonsense about the way she sat, no hesitation. Her hair was dark and coming loose from where she'd pinned it, probably from riding fast. She had her father's jaw, strong, set forward slightly, the jaw of someone who'd made decisions and lived with them. Elias had seen Vivian Mercer in town before. Everybody in Red Hollow had. Her father, Augustus Mercer, ran the largest dry goods operation in 3 counties, and Vivian had been working alongside him since she was old enough to count change. People respected the Mercers. Some envied them. A few were probably waiting for them to stumble. But Elias had never once had a conversation with Vivian Mercer. He wasn't sure she'd ever noticed him at all. She pulled the mare to a stop about 15 feet from where he was standing and looked at him for a second without speaking. Her eyes were dark brown, sharp, the kind that took stock of things quickly and didn't miss much. There was something behind them that he couldn't read right away. Not panic exactly, but something close to it, held very carefully in check. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Miss Mercer." He pulled his hat off out of habit, then wasn't sure if he should have. It felt strange, standing here with his hat in his hand and grease on his knuckles in front of the merchant's daughter. "Something I can do for you?" She didn't answer right away. She dismounted, smoothly, efficiently, like a woman who'd been getting on and off horses her entire life, and tied the mare to his fence post, the same fence post with the rusted bolt. He noticed her glance at the grease can and the pliers on the ground, and he had the brief, stupid impulse to kick them out of sight. She walked toward him, and she stopped when she was close enough that he could see she hadn't slept well. There were shadows beneath her eyes that she hadn't quite managed to cover, and there was a tension around her mouth that looked like it had been there for a while. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you say no." Elias looked at her carefully. "All right." Vivian Mercer took a breath. Not a dramatic breath, not the kind that sets up a speech. More like the breath a person takes when they're about to do something that costs them, and they've already decided to do it anyway. And the breath is just the last moment before there's no going back. "I need you to marry me," she said. The wind moved through the dried grass. Somewhere in the back pasture, one of his steers made a low, unhurried sound. Elias Boone stood there with his hat in his hand and looked at the woman who had just said those words to him, and the thing he felt, the first honest thing, before he could think about it properly, was not confusion. It was something that felt uncomfortably close to sorrow. Because she was serious. He could see that she was completely, painfully serious. And serious women who rode out to lonely ranches to ask solitary men to marry them were not doing so because the world had been kind to them lately. "You'd better come inside," he said. The inside of the ranch house was not a place designed to impress visitors. Elias knew that. He'd lived in it long enough that he'd stopped seeing it the way a stranger would see it. The low ceiling dark with years of wood smoke, the table with one leg shimmed up with a folded piece of leather, the single window above the dry sink that let in pale light, and not much of it. There was a rifle above the door and a calendar on the wall that was 6 months old, and a shelf of books that were the most organized things in the room. He put water on to boil because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, and he gestured toward the table. Vivian sat down without looking around the room, which he appreciated more than he would have admitted. She set her hands flat on the table. Her fingers were still. Not fidgeting, not ringing. Still in the way that people are still when they've been practicing calm for a long time and have gotten very good at it. "Before I explain," she said, "I want you to know that I didn't come to you because you're the only option. I came to you because you're the right one." Elias leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "That's a curious distinction. Why don't you start at the beginning?" So she did. "It started," she told him, "about 3 years ago. Maybe closer to 4. Sheriff Garrett Crow had been appointed to his position by the county magistrate. A political appointment, not an elected one, which meant he hadn't needed the town's approval to get the job and didn't especially need it to keep it. He was a competent lawman in the technical sense. He showed up, he handled trouble when it arrived, he made the town feel managed. People felt safe enough under him that they didn't ask too many questions. The first time he came to her father, Vivian said, it was framed as a business matter, a courtesy call. The sheriff stopping by to mention that he'd heard some concerns, from whom he didn't specify, about the weight measurements at the Mercer dry goods, whether everything was properly calibrated, whether an inspection might be warranted. Her father had understood immediately. Vivian was 17 at the time, and she'd been doing the accounts. She'd understood too. "He never actually asked for anything directly," she said. "Not the first time. He just left enough space for my father to fill in. My father filled it in." "What did he want?" 15% of every timber supply contract that went through our store. We handled the contracts for 3 of the 4 largest ranchers in the county at the time. It was significant money. Her jaw moved slightly. "He said it was for administrative assistance, keeping the county ledgers straight. He had a whole story about it." Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it without drinking. "Your father paid him for 4 years. She looked down at the cup. "I'm not saying it to condemn him. He had my mother to think about, and she was sick then. And he had employees, people who depended on the store. He thought it would stop." "It didn't stop." "It never stops," she said flatly. "You pay once, you've told him everything he needs to know about you, that you'll choose protection over principle when the cost is high enough. After that, he just has to keep raising the cost." Elias was quiet for a moment. Through the window he could see the clouds getting darker, moving faster. The storm was making up its mind. "What changed?" he asked. "Why come to me now?" Vivian set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly, and for the first time there was something in her eyes that wasn't controlled. A brief flash of something raw, something she hadn't quite managed to fold away in time. "My mother died in March," she said, "and in April, Garrett Crow came to my father and told him that the arrangement needed to expand. He wanted a percentage of the retail operation. Not just the contracts, the actual store. He'd done the numbers himself and presented them like it was a business proposal. He wanted part of the store. He wanted the store," she corrected, "in everything but name. He wanted regular payments large enough that within 5 years my father would have to sell. And Garrett had a buyer already picked out. A man from Fort Worth, who I suspect is either his cousin or his business partner, or both." She paused. "My father is 63 years old. He built that store out of nothing. It's the only thing he has left." Elias looked at her. Outside, the first distant rumble of thunder moved across the plains. "So where do I come in?" he said. Vivian sat up slightly straighter. It was a nearly imperceptible shift, but he caught it. The posture of a person who's reached the part of the conversation they've rehearsed and is determined to get through it cleanly. "Garrett has made it clear that the only way he leaves our family alone is if there's no longer a family worth troubling," she said. "He wants a store because my father's name carries it. If my father were no longer in a position to make decisions, if someone else were handling the business affairs, the leverage changes. Garrett's investment in controlling the Mercers dropped significantly. You're saying he goes after the name, not just the money. He goes after everything that makes us worth going after. If I marry someone outside his reach, someone he has no existing hold over, someone with enough standing in this county that removing them becomes complicated, it changes his calculation. She met his eyes. You own 600 acres free and clear. You've never borrowed from the county bank. You don't owe anyone anything. Garrett has nothing on you because there's nothing to have. Elias was quiet for a long moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the sky. The storm was coming. It was definitely coming now. You want to use a marriage to change the political math, he said. Yes. That's not a typical reason to get married. No, she agreed. It's not. He turned around and looked at her sitting at his table with her hands wrapped around his chipped coffee cup, and he thought about a lot of things in the space of a few seconds. He thought about what it meant that she'd ridden out here alone, to a ranch outside of town, to ask a man she barely knew to step into a fight that wasn't his. He thought about what it would cost her to do that, the pride it required to set aside, the desperation that had to be underneath it. He also thought about Garrett Crow, and the way the man moved through Red Hollow like he owned the air above the main street, and the 2 complaints Elias himself had quietly filed with the county seat over the past year that had gone nowhere. Documents misplaced, concerns noted and not pursued. Why me specifically? Elias said. There are other men in this county with land and no debt. Vivian looked at him steadily. Because you're the only one I trust not to become a problem yourself. He didn't say anything. I've watched you, she said. Not in a strange way, but in a town this size, you watch people whether you mean to or not. You've had 3 separate chances in the past 2 years to take advantage of situations that would have benefited you at someone else's expense. You didn't take any of them. Most men took at least one. Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He rubbed the back of his neck. This would be a marriage in name. That's up to you. I'm not here to negotiate the terms of something that hasn't been agreed to yet. She said it plainly, without any particular emotion attached. I'm asking you to agree to it first. The rest we can work out. And if I say no, then I thank you for the coffee and I figure out something else. She said it without bitterness, without manipulation, just a statement of fact. Elias looked at the woman across the table from him. He noticed that her hands had tightened slightly around the cup. Not much, just slightly. All right, he said. She blinked. All right, I'll do it. Vivian Mercer stared at him. For the first time since she'd arrived, something in her face moved in a way she hadn't planned for. Her composure didn't crack exactly, but it shifted, like a wall that had been built to hold weight and suddenly didn't need to hold quite as much. Just like that, she said. You laid out the situation clearly, Elias said. I don't need a week to think about whether a man who extorts widows and threatens old men should be stopped. He paused. Also, I've been wanting to do something about Garrett Crow for about 14 months. This gives me better standing than filing paper that disappears. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. You've already been watching him. I've been noting things, Elias said carefully. Conversations people have had with me in confidence. Dates, amounts, where people were willing to share them. He set his cup down. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it. Seemed like I'd figure it out when I had enough. How much do you have? He thought about the journal in the locked box beneath his bed. 14 months of careful, patient, stubborn record-keeping. Names he'd promised to protect. Stories people had only told him because he was quiet and unimportant, and they trusted that nothing he held would ever reach the wrong ears. Enough, he said. Maybe more than enough. Outside, the first fat drops of rain hit the window glass. The storm had finally made its decision. He walked her out to her horse 20 minutes later. They had talked about the basics, how they would make the announcement, what timeline made sense, how to handle her father. Practical things spoken in practical voices. The conversation had the strange quality of 2 people planning a business venture that happened to be on paper a marriage. At the fence post, Vivian untied the bay mare and swung up into the saddle. She gathered her reins and looked down at him. The rain was picking up, spotting her dark coat. Mr. Boone, she said. Elias, he said. If we're going to do this, you should probably call me by my name. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. Elias, she said, I want you to understand something. I know what I'm asking you to walk into. Garrett Crow isn't going to accept this quietly. I know. He's going to come at you. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, studying something, trying to figure out whether he genuinely understood or whether he was the kind of man who said he understood and then was surprised when things got hard. All right, she said finally. Whatever she'd been looking for, she'd apparently found enough of it. She turned the mare and rode out through the gate and down the drive, moving fast, her coat dark against the gray morning. Elias watched her go until she was past the line of trees at the edge of his property, and he couldn't see her anymore. Then he turned and looked at the fence post with the rusted bolt and the grease can and the pliers that were 2 sizes too small for the job. He picked up the pliers. He went back to work. But word reached Garrett Crow by mid-morning of the following day. That was how small Red Hollow was. That was how thoroughly the sheriff had built his web of information inside its limits. Someone at the feed store, probably. Or one of the hands who worked the property next to Elias's east fence. It didn't particularly matter. What mattered was that Garrett heard it, and Elias knew he would hear it, and the timing of it would tell him something useful about how many of the town's ordinary conversations made their way to the sheriff's ear. Garrett came to the ranch himself. He didn't bring his deputy. He rode alone, which was either confidence or a choice to keep things quiet, and Elias was already betting on confidence. Garrett Crow was the kind of man who'd never had a reason to be cautious around someone like Elias Boone, and a man's habits don't change just because the situation has. Elias was mending wire on the south fence when he heard the horse on the road. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the section he was on, clipped the wire, and set his tools down carefully before he turned. Garrett was already at the gate. He was a big man. Not fat, just large. The kind of large that had been useful once, and had since settled into something that was more presence than physicality. He had a lawman's face, not unkind on the surface, not obviously cruel. The cruelty was somewhere further back, in the eyes, in the way he held his shoulders like a man who had decided the world owed him deference and had been collecting on that debt for so long it felt like interest. He wasn't in uniform today. That was interesting. He left his horse at the road and walked through the gate uninvited, which Elias noted without commenting on. Boone, he said. Crow. Elias didn't offer his hand. He didn't make a production of not offering it. He just stood there with his wire cutters, relaxed, waiting. Garrett looked around the property with the particular gaze of a man who is assessing things and wants you to know he is. Nice spread, he said. Smaller than I remembered. I've never had you out here before, Elias said. No. Garrett smiled slightly. Suppose you haven't. He stopped about 8 feet away, which was conversational distance, but also the distance a man chooses when he wants the other man to understand that the gap between them could close quickly if he decided it should. I heard something interesting this morning. Things travel fast in Red Hollow. They do. Garrett put his hands in his coat pockets. A casual gesture, calculated casual. I heard you and the Mercer girl are planning to get married. That's right. Garrett tilted his head slightly. Seems fast. You two weren't what I'd call close. People surprise each other sometimes. They do, Garrett agreed pleasantly. They really do. He looked at the fence line for a moment, then back at Elias. I wanted to come by personally, offer my congratulations. And also, and I want to say this as a friend, Boone, as someone who's looked out for this town for a long time, I wanted to make sure you understood what you're walking into. How do you mean? Garrett's expression shifted just slightly. Not much. An adjustment, the way a man adjusts when he's dropping the social lubricant from his voice and getting to the actual point. The Mercers are in a complicated situation right now. Business trouble. I don't know how much Vivian's told you, but her father's in some difficulty. County tax matters. Bookkeeping irregularities that need to be sorted out. He said it with the particular smoothness of a man who has practiced making manufactured problems sound like regrettable facts. It wouldn't reflect well on you, professionally, if you were to find yourself legally connected to that family before those matters were resolved. Elias looked at him. He kept his face neutral, which was not difficult because he'd been keeping his face neutral in difficult conversations for 41 years. I appreciate the concern. Just being thorough. Garrett smiled again. Wider this time. which made it less like a smile. A man in my position hears things. I'd hate for you to find yourself on the wrong side of some documentation you didn't even know existed. There it was. Not a threat in any language that could be quoted, not a word that could be pointed to and named directly. Just the suggestion, suspended in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that could be anywhere. The documentation existed, that it could be shaped and placed, that the world had a particular order, and Elias's best interest lay in understanding his position within it. Elias let the silence sit for a moment. "I'll take that under consideration," he said. Garrett held his gaze for 2 seconds, 3, long enough to make sure the message had landed. Then he nodded, satisfied apparently with whatever he saw, and turned to walk back to his horse. "Congratulations again," he said over his shoulder. "Vivian's a fine woman." Elias watched him ride away. Then he picked up his wire cutters and went back to the fence. That evening, after supper, beans and cornbread, the same thing he'd eaten 3 nights running, because cooking for one person had never seemed worth elaborate effort, Elias sat at his table and opened the locked box he kept under the bed. The journal inside was a plain thing. Dark cloth cover, pages that had started to yellow at the edges. He'd bought it at the Mercer Dry Goods, which struck him now as somewhat fitting. He opened it to the current page and added to the entry he'd started 3 weeks ago. He wrote down Garrett's visit, the time, the exact words as close as he could reproduce them. Documentation you didn't even know existed. He wrote that phrase down twice because precision mattered, because the difference between a suggestion and a threat often lived in the exact words chosen and the exact order they were spoken in. Then he sat back and looked at what he'd written. 14 months of this. 17 separate accounts from 11 different people. Some of them given to him over a fence. Some of them over a shared bottle on someone's porch in the evening. One of them in a letter written in a schoolteacher's careful hand that still sat folded in the back of the journal, because the woman who'd written it had asked him to keep it somewhere safe. He'd promised all of them the same thing, that he would use what they told him only when he was certain he could do it in a way that didn't leave them worse off than they'd started. He'd been waiting for the right moment, for enough weight, for a lever long enough and a place to stand. He turned to the back of the journal where he'd written a name 2 months ago and circled it. Circuit Judge Raymond Hale. Known for 3 things in those parts: an absolute intolerance for corruption in law enforcement, a willingness to travel for cases of significant public interest, and a reputation so clean that even Garrett Crow had never tried to approach him. Elias had never met Judge Hale, but he knew a man who had, and he'd written a letter, careful, factual, direct, and sent it 3 weeks ago. He hadn't received a reply yet, but he was patient. He had always been patient. Patience was one of the only virtues that life on a working ranch taught you without asking. He closed the journal and locked the box and slid it back under the bed. Then he went and stood at the window for a while, looking out at his land in the dark. 600 acres that he'd worked for 11 years. That he'd bought one parcel at a time with money he'd saved and resaved and protected with a kind of obsessive care that probably made him odd in people's eyes, though they were too polite to say so. The quiet had never bothered him much. Some people couldn't stand quiet. Some people needed the noise of other people around them all the time just to feel like they existed. Elias had always found quiet more honest than the alternative. Noise could cover a lot of things. Quiet showed you what was actually there. But standing at the window that night, he was aware of the quiet differently than usual. Not as something peaceful, as something waiting. The whole dark spread of his land out there, the grass moving faintly, the distant sound of cattle, the stars appearing one by one above the flat horizon. All of it waiting, the way things wait before the thing that changes them finally arrives. He thought about Vivian Mercer sitting at his table that morning, the way she'd held the coffee cup, the way she'd looked at him when he'd said all right, not relieved exactly, recalculated. He didn't know her. Not really. You didn't know a person from watching them across the width of a small town for however many years, but he knew enough to know that she was not a person who asked for help easily, and that what she'd done that morning had cost her something real, and that she'd done it anyway because the alternative was watching her father lose the only thing he'd built his life around. He understood that. The specific kind of love that makes a person do something they'd never otherwise do. He turned away from the window. Tomorrow he'd ride to town. Not to see Vivian. They had agreed to keep their contact minimal and practical until things moved forward. He'd ride to town to pick up supplies and to listen and to watch, the way he always did, except now with a sharper purpose. Garrett Crow would be watching him. That was certain. What Garrett would be looking for was any sign that Elias could be pressured, diverted, or frightened into stepping back. What Elias intended to give him was nothing. A calm face and steady hands and the appearance of a man going about ordinary business, which was, in fact, exactly what he was doing. He was just doing it with a plan underneath that Garrett didn't know existed yet. 3 days after Vivian's visit, Elias received a reply to his letter. It came through the postal service in an envelope with no return address, sealed with plain wax. He opened it at the kitchen table, alone, with his coffee going cold beside him. The letter was short. 4 sentences. Mr. Boone, your correspondence has been received and reviewed with serious attention. The matters described fall within a category of my jurisdiction that I take personally. I will be in the Red Hollow County area during the 2nd week of November. If you can arrange a meeting under conditions of reasonable privacy, I will attend. It was signed R. Hale. Elias read it twice, then he folded it and burned it in the stove. He sat back down and looked at the table for a while. November was 5 weeks away. 5 weeks was a long time in a situation that was already moving. A lot could happen in 5 weeks. Garrett could escalate faster than expected. Someone could break. Someone could talk to the wrong person. But 5 weeks was also enough time to fill in what he was missing, to approach the 2 people he hadn't yet spoken to, who he knew had the clearest view of Garrett's operations. A former deputy who'd left town under awkward circumstances, and a county records clerk who'd mentioned once, in passing, that she'd been asked to process some documents that didn't smell right to her. 5 weeks. Elias got up, refilled his coffee, and sat back down at the table with his journal. He had work to do. That Sunday, Elias drove his wagon into town and attended the gathering at the feed hall that served as the community's informal Sunday meeting place. Not for any particular social reason, because he was not a social man by nature, but because he had learned over the 14 months of keeping his journal that the feed hall on Sunday was where information moved. He sat near the back with his coffee and said very little and watched. Garrett Crow was there, which was not unusual. The sheriff made a habit of showing up at public gatherings, always projecting the same comfortable ownership of the room, like a man who knows that being seen is itself a form of power. He worked the space, moving from group to group, laughing at the right moments, keeping his hand visible on shoulders, always positioned near the men who mattered in town without ever appearing to need them. But today Elias noticed something he hadn't seen quite this clearly before. He noticed the way the conversations changed when Garrett approached. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but there was a tightening, a slight shift in how people held themselves, a fraction of a second where eyes moved to find the nearest exit from the conversation, and then the decision to stay and perform ease rather than actually feel it. People were afraid, not of Garrett specifically, in the sense of being afraid of immediate harm. They were afraid of the general condition he represented, the knowledge that he could make things difficult, that he had in the past and would in the future, that the calculation of engaging with him had a hidden cost that everyone understood even if no one named it. And no one said anything. Because saying something meant being the first. And being the first in a town like Red Hollow meant being alone. And being alone against a man with a badge and county resources and a buyer in Fort Worth was not a survivable position for ordinary people. Elias watched all of this and thought about the 17 accounts in his journal and thought about Raymond Hale and the letter he'd burned in the stove. He was patient. He had always been patient. He just needed everyone else to hold on for 5 more weeks. He was loading his wagon outside the general store when Tom Lester appeared beside him, one of his neighbors, a small rancher with a family and a persistent fence problem that Elias had helped him with the previous spring. Tom was a mild man with a habit of looking over his shoulder when he talked, which had gotten more pronounced in recent months. "Heard about you and Vivian Mercer," Tom said quietly, keeping his eyes on the wagon rather than on Elias. "Word travels." "It does." Tom was quiet for a moment, picking at a splinter on the wagon sideboard. "You know what you're getting into." "I have some idea." Tom nodded. He didn't look up. "Garrett's already talking, saying you're making a mistake, that the Mercers have county trouble." He paused. You know what that means. I know what it means. Tom finally looked at him. He was a man of maybe 50, weathered, not given to sentiment. His eyes held something that wasn't quite a question, but was near one. You got a plan? Elias finished loading the last bag and dusted off his hands. I've got some things in motion. Tom looked at him for a long moment. If there's something I could do... He stopped, started again. That business last year, with my water rights. The way the documentation got changed without me being asked, I kept a record of it. Elias turned to look at him directly. I know you did, he said. I remember what you told me. Tom Lester held his gaze. If you need me to say it somewhere official... Another pause, shorter this time. I would. Elias nodded once. I'll let you know. Tom nodded back and walked away without another word. Elias climbed onto the wagon and gathered the reins. One more. That was 17 accounts and one more possible, which made 18. He turned the wagon toward the road and headed home through the beginning of dusk, the sky going purple and orange behind the flat horizon, the town of Red Hollow falling back behind him as he rode. Somewhere behind him, in his ranch house, in the locked box under his bed, 17 months of slow, patient, meticulous work waited for its moment. 5 weeks. He drove his horses into the evening, and he kept his eyes on the road ahead, and he did not look back. The first cattle went missing on a Tuesday. Elias discovered it the way you discover most bad things on a ranch. Not all at once, but in pieces. The way a picture assembles itself slowly from wrong details that your eye keeps snagging on. He did his morning count on the east pasture and came up 4 short. He told himself it was possible they'd push through a gap in the fence somewhere, which happened, which was a normal and irritating thing that happened on ranches. He walked the east fence line for an hour and found no gap. He walked it again. Still no gap. By afternoon, he'd covered the south pasture and the creek bottom and the rocky stretch along the property's north edge that the cattle usually avoided because the footing was poor. He found nothing. 4 steers, 2 of them good breeding stock he'd been planning to hold through winter, simply gone. He stood at the edge of the north pasture in the fading light and looked at the ground. The grass was too dry to hold tracks well, but there was a section near the fence where the soil was softer from a spring that ran slow and underground, and in that section he could see what he'd half expected to see. Not one set of marks, multiple sets. Boots, several pairs, moving in a deliberate pattern, and the compressed earth where cattle had been driven through a section of fence that had since been replaced so carefully that you'd have to know what you were looking for to spot it. He crouched down and looked at the replaced section for a long time. Someone had taken his cattle and put the fence back. That was the detail that told him everything. A random theft leaves a broken fence. A message leaves a repaired one. He stood up and walked back to the house in the dark. He didn't report it to the sheriff. The thought crossed his mind and exited quickly, the way sensible thoughts do when the context makes them absurd. He could imagine Garrett's face, concerned, thorough, making the right noises while his eyes did the opposite of what his mouth was doing. He could imagine the paperwork being filed and the investigation going nowhere, and meanwhile his name being circulated quietly as a man with livestock problems, which in cattle country was the kind of reputation that accumulated weight slowly and took a long time to shake. Instead, he rode over to see Pete Alderman, whose property shared a half-mile of fence with Elias on the west. Pete was 60, hard of hearing in one ear, and had lived in the area long enough to know every face that moved through it. He also had 2 dogs that slept light and a habit of sitting on his porch until well past midnight because he said he'd never needed much sleep. You see anything moving on my fence line last few nights? Elias asked, standing at Pete's gate. Pete chewed on something. Tobacco, probably. He always had something in his cheek, and looked thoughtful. Night before last, he said. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving slow. I figured it was your boys bringing something in late. He paused. You don't have boys. I don't. Pete looked at him. How many did you lose? 4. Breeding stock, 2 of them. Pete spat. You report it? Not yet. Pete nodded slowly, like a man who understands exactly why not yet means what it means. You want me to say what I saw if it comes to it? I'd appreciate it. All right. Pete went back to his chewing. You want to come in? Martha made pie. Not tonight, Elias said, but thank you. He rode home through the full dark and sat at his table for a while without lighting the lamp, just thinking in the quiet, and then he opened his journal and wrote down what Pete had told him with the date and the time. The entry was 2 paragraphs. He reread it twice, then added a third paragraph that was just 1 sentence. This is the beginning of the active campaign against me, which means the engagement has been taken seriously. He closed the journal. He went to bed. He lay awake for an hour, which was unusual for him. He was normally asleep inside of 10 minutes, one of the few uncomplicated reliabilities of his body. And then he slept. 2 days later, he lost 6 more. This time it was from the west pasture, the section furthest from the house, where the land dipped into a shallow draw that blocked sound. He found the same careful fence repair. He found the same boot marks near the spring soil. He found, additionally, a single piece of rope left beside the post. Not accidentally dropped, but placed, coiled neatly. The kind of detail that had no practical purpose except to demonstrate that the person who'd been there wanted him to know they'd been there, wanted him to feel watched, wanted the watching to feel inevitable. Elias picked up the rope and looked at it for a moment. Then he tossed it into the draw and walked back to his horse. He had now lost 10 head of cattle. That was real money. That was months of work. And more specifically, it was months of work he would not be recovering unless things resolved in his favor, which was not certain, which he understood was not certain. He let himself feel the weight of that for a minute. Not because he was given to self-pity, but because he'd learned a long time ago that pretending things didn't cost what they cost was a form of dishonesty that eventually caught up with you. It cost 10 cattle. He felt that. Then he put it somewhere manageable and got back on his horse and rode toward town. He had a meeting to keep. The school teacher's name was Clara Dean. She'd been teaching at the Red Hollow Schoolhouse for 7 years, which was longer than most teachers stayed in a frontier town. And the reason she'd stayed was that she was stubborn and she was good at the work, and she'd decided a long time ago that stubbornness in service of something worthwhile wasn't a character flaw. She was 34, unmarried, and she wore her practicality the way some women wore jewelry, openly and with a certain pride in it. She'd written Elias a letter 8 months ago, a careful letter. It described 3 instances in which she'd been approached by the sheriff with what she described as suggestions regarding the curriculum, specifically suggestions that certain civic lessons about the authority of local law enforcement be emphasized, and that certain discussions of individual rights and county charter obligations be de-emphasized. She'd declined each time. The 3rd time, Garrett had stopped suggesting and started being specific about the county's ability to review teaching appointments annually. She'd written the letter and sent it to Elias because, she said, she'd seen him at the feed hall listening to people, and she'd decided he was the kind of man who kept things. She wasn't wrong. They met at the edge of town, near the water trough behind the livery, at a time Elias had suggested in a brief note, because it was the quietest hour of the afternoon when most people were in their businesses and the street was as close to empty as it ever got. Clara arrived first. She was wearing her school day dress and carrying a satchel, and she looked exactly like what she was, a teacher between school hours, which made their meeting look like nothing in particular if anyone happened to see it. They took more cattle, she said when he was close enough to hear her say it quietly. News travels. It does here. She glanced down the street, a quick professional check, then back at him. Are you all right? I'm fine. The cattle aren't, but I'm fine. She almost smiled at that. I heard something yesterday that you should know about. One of my older students, I won't say which one, mentioned that his father came home 2 nights ago later than expected. Said he'd been asked to drive a wagon. Said the man who asked him had a county badge. Elias was quiet for a moment. He volunteered that? The student? He's 12. He was proud of his father being trusted with something official. The edge in Clara's voice was controlled but present, like a wire pulled tight. He doesn't know what it means. What about the father? Afraid, she said simply. He won't say more, but I thought you should know there's a name that might exist if someone official asked the right questions in the right way. Elias nodded. He filed it away. How are you holding up? Clara looked at him. It was an honest question, and she appeared to consider it honestly. I'm holding, she said. I'd like this to be over. So would I. Is it going to be? He looked at her steadily. He didn't tell her about Judge Hale, because the fewer people who knew that, the better. Not because he didn't trust Clara, but because information had a way of moving through a small town regardless of the trustworthiness of the person carrying it. "I have things in motion," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, some combination of assessment and decision. And then she nodded, which appeared to mean she'd decided to take that on faith. "If you need my letter formalized," she said, "a signed statement, whatever's useful, tell me. I want to be useful." "I will." She picked up her satchel and walked back toward the schoolhouse, and Elias stood by the water trough for a moment and looked down the main street of Red Hollow. Garrett's office was at the far end, the county badge mounted above the door catching light. From this distance, it was just a shape, a piece of metal. It could have been anything. He turned and went to collect his horse. Vivian came to the ranch on Thursday. This time she knocked, which was different from the first time when she'd just pulled up and announced herself, and he noted the difference without commenting on it. Something had shifted slightly between that first morning and now, not toward anything in particular, just away from the sharp formality that had characterized the initial conversation. They were two people who had made a significant agreement and were now in the awkward position of having to exist in proximity to that agreement before they'd figured out what it actually meant for either of them. She came inside and sat at the table, and he poured coffee, and for a few minutes they went through the practical things that needed to be discussed, the announcement she'd placed in the county paper, the response from her father, the question of whether to set a date or leave it vague for the moment. Her father, she said, had reacted to the news of the engagement, the way a man reacts when he's been holding something very heavy for a very long time and someone appears to offer help, but he's not yet certain whether the offer is real. He'd asked her twice if she was sure. She'd told him twice that she was. He hadn't asked a third time, which meant he'd chosen to believe her, which was its own kind of courage for a man in his position. "He wants to meet you," she said. "I figured he would. Saturday, maybe? At the store after closing? It would look ordinary. You stopping by to pick up something. He stays late to do accounts on Saturdays." "That works." Elias turned his cup in his hands. "How is he, really?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. She had a way of pausing before answers that came from actually considering the question rather than reaching for the convenient response. "Tired," she said finally. "He's been tired for a long time. He put on a good face when I told him, but I could see—" She stopped. Started again with a slightly different angle. "He's been carrying this alone. He didn't want me to know the full extent of it. I had to find most of it out on my own. Because he was protecting you." "Because he was ashamed," she corrected, and there was something complicated in her voice. Not anger, but not entirely free of it either. He thought it was his failing, that he should have found a way out of it on his own. She looked at her coffee. "He's a proud man. It cost him to have his daughter know." Elias thought about Augustus Mercer, whom he'd seen in town over the years. A solid, upright man who carried himself with the particular dignity of someone who'd built everything they had from nothing and knew exactly how much it had cost. The thought of that man being systematically bled for 4 years, watching everything he'd built being slowly redirected toward someone else's pocket, told to frame it in his own mind as a business arrangement so he could live with it. That thought sat unpleasantly in Elias's chest, and he let it sit there. "He's not going to be in debt to me," Elias said. "Whatever comes of this, he needs to understand that what I'm doing isn't something he's going to owe me for." Vivian looked at him. "Why not?" "Because a man who feels he owes you doesn't stand up straight when he talks to you, and I'd rather he stood up straight." She held his gaze for a moment, something in her expression that he was starting to recognize, that fractional shift when something he said landed somewhere she hadn't expected. "I'll tell him," she said. The trouble at the Mercer store started 5 days later. It began with a visit from a county land assessor, a man named Griggs, who came from the county seat with papers in a self-important manner and spent 2 hours going through the store's floor plan and exterior measurements with the stated purpose of updating county records. Nothing was taken. Nothing was formally accused. But Griggs mentioned, in the particular way that Garrett's people always mention things, that there appeared to be a discrepancy in the store's registered square footage compared to the current configuration, which could, potentially, affect the property tax classification, which was a matter the county would need to look into, which might take some time to resolve, during which certain commercial licenses could be considered provisional. Augustus Mercer came to Elias with this on a Tuesday morning, arriving at the ranch with the posture of a man who has spent his whole life not asking for help and is finding it even harder than he'd imagined. He was a taller man than Elias had expected up close, still upright despite everything. Good shoulders, the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now simply honest. He had Vivian's eyes, the sharp dark brown ones, though in him they carried a different expression, where hers was calculation. His was something more like grief that had been carefully organized. "I don't want to bring my trouble to your door," Augustus said. He was standing in Elias's yard, hat in his hands, which Elias recognized as a posture the man had not chosen casually. "But my daughter tells me you're someone who can be told the full thing." "Come inside," Elias said. "Tell me all of it." Augustus sat at the table and talked for 40 minutes. He was precise about numbers and dates, the way a merchant would be. He'd kept records of every payment, not in any place Garrett would find them, but in a ledger he'd hidden inside the false back of a shipping crate in the store's back room. He'd been keeping that ledger since the second payment, because some part of him had known, even then, that he was going to need it someday, even if he couldn't see how. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the table with the expression of a man who has just unloaded something that was heavier than he'd let himself acknowledge for a long time. "That ledger," Elias said carefully. "How detailed is it?" "Dates? Amounts? I wrote down what was said at each meeting as close as I could remember, as soon as I got home. I didn't trust my memory over time." He paused. "I'm a bookkeeper by habit. I record things." Elias looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, that ledger is one of the most important documents in this whole situation. You understand that." "I'm beginning to." "Where is it right now?" Augustus named the crate and the location in the back room. Elias thought about it for a moment. "I want you to move it," he said. "Not out of the store. Not yet, that might be noticed. But somewhere different in the store. And I want you to not tell Vivian where." Augustus looked at him. "Why not Vivian?" "Because if Garrett ever puts pressure on her specifically, she can honestly tell him she doesn't know where it is. She's a poor liar." He said it without cruelty. "It's not a failing. It's just who she is. She'll be more useful in this if she's not carrying a secret she has to hide." Augustus was quiet for a moment. He appeared to be reassessing something about the man sitting across from him, turning him slightly in the light, the way you turn something to see if the quality holds from different angles. "All right, Tate," he said. "One more thing," Elias said. "That ledger and my journal need to meet up with a man before the 15th of November. Until then, you hold it, I hold mine, and neither of us talks about either of them to anyone we're not absolutely certain of." "Who's the man?" Elias looked at him steadily. "Someone who can make it official and make it stick." Augustus held his gaze and appeared to make a decision. "I trust my daughter's judgment," he said finally. "She's been right about people more often than I have." He stood up, put his hat back on, and they shook hands at the door. A simple handshake, working man's grip, the kind that means something because both parties know what it's sealing. After he left, Elias went back inside and sat at the table and thought about what he had now versus what he'd had 2 weeks ago. He had a merchant's detailed ledger. He had signed and signable accounts from 11 individuals, including a school teacher and a neighboring rancher and a former field hand and several others. He had Pete Alderman's witnessed account of the night the cattle were taken. He had his own journal. What he still needed, what would make the difference between evidence and overwhelming evidence, was someone who'd worked close enough to Garrett to speak to the pattern from inside. He'd been avoiding that piece because it was the most dangerous one to pursue. Inside men talk to inside people. If Garrett got word that his former deputy was being approached, the whole situation could accelerate in directions that were hard to control. But 3 days before Garrett's campaign against him escalated in a way that changed the calculation entirely, Elias found that piece without having to go looking for it. The former deputy was named Will Sayers. He'd left Red Hollow 14 months ago under circumstances that people in town described vaguely as disagreements about methods, which was the kind of phrase that covered a lot of ground. He'd settled on a small plot 20 miles north, near a town called Durant, where he'd apparently been keeping to himself and not talking much. He came to Elias's ranch on a Thursday evening, arriving just before dark on a horse that needed feeding, wearing clothes that had been slept in more than once. He looked like a man who'd been having a long argument with something inside himself and had recently reached a conclusion about it. "You're Boone," he said at the gate. I am. I heard you're getting married to Vivian Mercer. That's right. Will Sayers stood there for a moment, one hand on his horse's neck. He was younger than Elias had expected, maybe 32, 33, with the face of someone who'd seen things that had aged him beyond the number. I heard why, he said, or I can guess why. Word gets around even 20 miles north. Elias looked at him. You want to come in? Yeah. Sayers tied his horse and followed him inside. I want to tell you something. I've been sitting on it for 14 months and it's gotten heavier every month. And I decided on the ride down here that I'd rather put it somewhere it can be used than keep carrying it by myself. He sat at Elias's table and talked for 2 hours. What he described was systematic, organized, and long-running. False evidence, manufactured charges against people who had resisted Garrett's arrangements, records altered in the county files, money moved through shell accounts that Garrett had set up under names of businesses that did not exist. Will had discovered the last part by accident. He'd been sent to retrieve a document from the county filing office and had pulled the wrong folder. When he'd gone to Garrett with what he'd found, intending to report it as a clerical confusion, Garrett had looked at him for a long moment and then told him very quietly that the wisest thing Will could do was to forget he'd ever seen that folder. Will had been a deputy for 5 years. He was not a naive man. He understood what he'd just been told and what it meant about the man who'd said it. He'd resigned 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and gotten out of Red Hollow as quietly as he could manage. I should have gone to someone then, he said. He was looking at the table, not at Elias. I told myself there was nobody to go to. That might have been true, but I also told myself that because it was easier than deciding to do something that scared me. Elias didn't tell him he was wrong. He didn't tell him it was understandable. He just said, "You're here now." Sayers looked up. I need to know it counts for something, that it doesn't just disappear. It won't disappear, Elias said. I promise you that. He got out his journal and his pen, and they sat at the table until well past midnight, and Will Sayers told him everything he remembered, and Elias wrote it down in his careful, precise hand with the dates and the amounts and the names of businesses that did not exist. By the time they finished, the coffee had long since gone cold, and the lamp was burning low, and Will Sayers looked like a man who had set down something he'd been carrying wrong for over a year, a little lighter, a little uncertain of how to stand without the weight, but unmistakably lighter. What happens now? Sayers asked. You go back to Durant, Elias said. You wait to hear from me. When the time comes, I'm going to need you to say all of that somewhere official. I'll say it. He said it without hesitation, and the steadiness in his voice was the steadiness of a decision that had already been made, not one being made in the moment. Whatever it takes. Elias walked him out to his horse. The night was cold and completely still, the kind of still that meant a clear sky and temperatures dropping fast. Will Sayers mounted up and gathered his reins, and for a moment he just sat there, looking down at Elias in the dark. You're a careful man, Sayers said. Not a compliment exactly, more an observation, the kind you make when you've been watching something and trying to understand it. I try to be. He's going to try to break something before you can stop him, Sayers said. He always does that. When he feels something coming, he moves against whatever the person cares about most, tries to get there first. He paused. Thought you should know that. I know, Elias said. Sayers nodded, turned the horse, and rode off into the dark toward the north road. Elias stood in the cold for a moment after the hoofbeats faded, thinking about what Sayers had said. Whatever the person cares about most. He thought about his 10 missing steers, which were money and months of work, but were manageable. He thought about the county assessor at the Mercer store, which was pressure but was slow pressure, the kind designed to wear rather than destroy. He thought about what else there was, what Garrett hadn't moved against yet. He went inside and got his journal and turned to the entry from 3 weeks ago, the one that began with Vivian arriving on his property on a gray October morning with dark circles under her eyes and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He read through it slowly, the way he read everything in the journal, carefully, looking for the thing he might have missed the first time. He didn't find anything he'd missed, but the rereading reminded him of something that Sayers had put more clearly than he'd been able to put it to himself. Garrett Crow was not a patient man underneath the performance of patience. He was a man who controlled things because he could not tolerate the alternative, and a man who cannot tolerate losing control when he feels it slipping does not wait. 11 days remained until the second week of November. Elias locked the journal back in its box and put the box under the bed and lay down and stared at the ceiling in the dark. 11 days. And whatever Garrett was going to do next, he was going to do it soon. The warrant arrived on a Monday. Elias was at the south fence again. He'd been working that fence line more than it strictly needed, partly because it needed it, and partly because physical work was the only thing that kept his mind from running the same calculations over and over without producing new answers. When he heard the wagon coming up the drive and turned to see Deputy Holt sitting on the bench with a piece of paper in his hand and the particular expression of a man who is following orders, he finds distasteful, but has decided the distaste is not his problem. Holt was young, 26, maybe 27. He'd only been deputy for 8 months, which meant he hadn't been around long enough to know what Garrett had been before Holt arrived, only what Garrett was now, which was the man who signed his pay vouchers and told him where to be. Elias didn't hold that against him. You couldn't hold a man's ignorance against him when the ignorance had been carefully constructed by someone with a professional interest in maintaining it. "Mr. Boone," Holt said. He held out the paper without getting down from the wagon. Elias walked over and took it. He read it without expression, which took some effort, because what was written on it was not what he'd expected. Not a land claim, not a tax matter, not anything he'd prepared for specifically. It was a theft charge. His name listed as the subject of a formal complaint. The complainant, a rancher named Boyd Caswell, whose property sat 8 miles east and who Elias had spoken to exactly once, 2 years ago, at a county livestock fair. The charge: theft of 6 head of cattle. His 6 head. His missing cattle. Filed against him as if he'd taken them from someone else. He read it twice and handed it back to Holt. "This is going to need a response," he said. His voice came out level, which surprised him slightly. "Yes, sir." Holt had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm to inform you that you'll need to present yourself at the county office by Friday to address the matter, or a more formal action will be initiated." "I understand." Holt hesitated. He seemed to want to say something else and was arguing with himself about whether to say it. The argument didn't last long. He clicked his tongue at the horses and turned the wagon around and drove back down the drive. Elias stood in the sun with the paper no longer in his hand and thought about Boyd Caswell. He thought about what it had cost Garrett to get Caswell to sign a complaint. Money, probably. Or a promise of something. Or, and this was the version that felt most likely, a threat of something. Caswell wasn't a wealthy man, and a man who isn't wealthy and has his name attached to a sheriff's operation has limited choices about whether to cooperate. He went inside and got his journal and wrote down the date and the charge and Holt's name and the exact wording of the warrant as best he could reproduce it. Then he sat back and looked at what he'd written and thought about the math of it. 9 days until November's second week. 9 days until Judge Hale was due in the area. The warrant was designed to do one of 2 things. Either force him to spend the next 9 days managing a legal defense that would consume his attention and his resources, or give Garrett a framework to escalate into something more severe if Elias didn't back down. Either way, the timing was not accidental. He closed the journal and rode into town. Vivian was at the store when he arrived, which was where she usually was on weekdays, working the counter while her father handled the back. She saw him come through the door, and something in her face shifted. She registered that something had happened before he'd said a word, which told him she'd been watching for it. She called to one of the store's hired boys to take the counter and led Elias to the back room where the crates were stacked and the accounts ledger sat on its sloped desk. Augustus was there, marking inventory, and he looked up when they came in and read the same thing in Elias's face that Vivian had. "He filed a warrant," Elias said. He told them what it said. Augustus set down his pencil. His jaw moved slightly, but he didn't speak. Vivian said, "Boyd Caswell signed it? That's the name on it." She made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a short exhale and a contemptuous syllable. "Caswell has been behind on his supply account with us for 8 months. Garrett's been carrying that note. I've seen it referenced in communications." She looked at Elias. "He didn't volunteer to sign it." "No," Elias agreed. "He didn't." "Can they make the charge hold?" Augustus asked. His voice was controlled, but it had the careful quality of a man controlling something that wanted to move faster. Not if the truth gets in front of someone who can hear it, Elias said. Which brings me to why I came. He looked at both of them. He'd been deciding on the ride into town how much to tell them, and he'd made the decision by the time he tied his horse outside. They'd been living in the dark for them to be steady, and people were steadier when they weren't surprised. I need to tell you about Judge Hale, he told them. Not everything, not Will Sayers, because that piece needed to stay protected a while longer, but the letter, the reply, the timeline, the plan he'd been building in the journal for 14 months, and the pieces that had come together in the last few weeks. He watched their faces as he talked. Augustus went through several expressions in the space of a few minutes. Surprise, a complicated relief, and something that looked like it might eventually become anger directed at himself for not having done something earlier, which Elias recognized as the feeling you get when someone else does the thing you'd told yourself couldn't be done. Vivian's face was harder to read because she'd been practicing reading other people's expressions for so long that she'd gotten careful about giving her own away. But at some point while he was talking, some of the tension around her mouth released, just slightly, in the way tension releases when you've been holding something for a long time and something solid finally appears. When he finished, it was Augustus who spoke first. "A circuit judge," he said, "in secret. In secret until the morning we need him not to be." "And what morning is that?" Elias said, "I'm working on that." He looked at the two of them. "What I need from both of you right now is to keep this between us and to behave exactly as you have been. Don't change anything visible. Don't react to the warrant in any way that suggests you have something up your sleeve. Garrett is watching for that." Vivian nodded slowly. "He'll expect you to come to me panicked or angry. So I'll be neither. And the warrant? Friday is 9 days early." Elias had thought about this on the ride in. "I'll go to the county office on Thursday. I'll tell them I need time to prepare a response and request a 2-week extension to gather documentation. That's within my rights. It buys time, and it makes me look like a man working within the system rather than against it, which is exactly the posture I want." Augustus looked at him steadily. "You've thought about this a long time." "I've had time to think." Most men would have. Augustus stopped. He seemed to be reorganizing what he'd started to say. Most men would have taken a different approach. "I know," Elias said. He didn't elaborate on what the different approach would have looked like, because they all knew, and naming it served no purpose. He left the store 20 minutes later and walked out into the main street of Red Hollow, and almost immediately he saw Garrett. The sheriff was coming out of the land office across the street, unhurried, hands in his coat pockets. He saw Elias at the same moment. There was a pause, 2 beats, 3, where they simply looked at each other across the width of the street with the wagon traffic moving between them. Then Garrett smiled. It was a genuine smile, which made it worse than the manufactured ones. A smile of a man who believes the game is going exactly as he designed it. Elias nodded once, the way you nod to an acquaintance, and turned and walked to his horse and rode out of town without looking back. The next 9 days were the longest he could remember since the first winter on the ranch, when he'd been running low on feed and the snow had come 3 weeks early, and he'd had to make rationing decisions that kept him awake every night wondering if he'd read the situation correctly. That winter had taught him something that he thought about often, that the hardest part of any long wait was not the uncertainty exactly, but the way uncertainty made every ordinary hour feel like evidence of something going wrong. You had to keep choosing every morning to believe that your preparation was adequate, and you had to make that choice even on the mornings when it felt most hollow. He went to the county office on Thursday and made his request for an extension, which the clerk, a young woman named Addie Pierce, who had something careful in her eyes when she looked at him, processed without comment, but with a look that lasted just slightly longer than the transaction required. He filed his request and got his 2-week extension and rode home. On Friday, Clara Dean found a note tucked into the schoolhouse door when she arrived to open up. It wasn't signed. It said simply, "Back off before you become the example." She brought it to Elias wrapped in a cloth, having had the presence of mind not to handle it more than necessary. He added it to the journal. His hands were steady when he wrote the entry, steadier than he might have expected, because by this point the escalation had taken on a kind of rhythm that made each new move legible. Garrett was getting nervous. Nervous men moved faster and thought less. On Sunday, Pete Alderman rode over to report that someone had come onto his property during the night and cut his west fence line in 3 places, which was Pete's fence, Pete's problem. Except that Pete's west fence was the one that ran adjacent to Elias's north pasture, and the cuts were precisely positioned to allow cattle to move from Elias's land through Pete's and onto the road. It was a setup for a future accusation, or possibly for another theft that could be blamed on the open fence, or both. Pete had already repaired it himself. He stood in Elias's yard with his hat in his hands, not the submissive posture it might have been on someone else, but the posture of a man who has made a decision about where he stands and wants to make that clear in person. "Whatever you need," Pete said. "I'll be there." 2 days before the second week of November, Elias rode the 20 miles north to Durant. He found Will Sayers at the small plot he'd described, a modest piece of land, some chickens, a vegetable garden that was done for the year, the overall appearance of a man living small and quiet and waiting for something to change. Sayers came out of the barn when he heard the horse and looked at Elias without speaking, asking the question with his face. "It's time," Elias said. "Can you be in Red Hollow on Wednesday?" Sayers looked at him for a moment. "Yes. I need you there early, before the town gets busy. I'll tell you where to be." "All right." Sayers leaned against the barn door. He looked tired, the way a man looks tired when the waiting has been harder than the doing. "It's really happening. It's really happening." Sayers was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the flat landscape to the south, the direction of Red Hollow, though you couldn't see it from here. "I've been thinking about this for 14 months, he said. "Now that it's actually—" He stopped and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not going to back out. I just want you to know that I know what I'm saying when I say I'll be there." "I know," Elias said. He rode back south and arrived home after dark and sat at his table with his journal open, and for the first time since he'd started it, he didn't write anything new. He just read it. All of it, from the beginning. The first entry dated 14 months ago, when a rancher named Hicks had told him over a fence post about a tax document that had changed without his signature. He read every entry in sequence, the whole record of a year and 2 months of quiet, stubborn, meticulous attention. 17 accounts now, plus his own observations, plus the warrant, and Clara's note, and Pete's fence line. He read it all, and when he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. He thought about the morning Vivian had ridden up his drive in the gray October light, and he thought about what he'd felt when he'd first looked at her. Not the immediate thing, not the social reflex, but the thing underneath it, the recognition of a person who had run out of other options and was making the hardest ask of their life and doing it without flinching. He thought about Augustus with his merchant's careful ledger hidden in a false-backed crate. He thought about Clara Dean and her signed letter and the way she'd said, "I want to be useful." He thought about Tom Lester picking at a splinter and not looking at him and saying, "I would." He thought about Pete Alderman on his porch in the cold. He thought about Will Sayers riding 20 miles south in the dark on a horse that needed feeding. Ordinary people, every single one of them, people who had lives that Garrett's operation touched only at the edges, or not so much at the edges as at the places where their ordinary lives depended on things being fair, on a county that operated the way it was supposed to operate, on a badge meaning what a badge was supposed to mean. People who'd been told by the whole weight of the situation that speaking up was not survivable, and who had done it anyway when someone appeared who made it feel less like a solo act. He closed the journal and locked the box. Wednesday morning, 2 days. He went to bed, and this time he slept without difficulty, which surprised him when he thought about it later. Maybe his body understood something his mind was still processing, that the time for lying awake running calculations was over, and what was coming now required a different kind of readiness. Judge Raymond Hale arrived in Red Hollow on the evening of the 10th of November, which was a Tuesday, which was the day before Elias had planned to act. He came in an unmarked wagon with a single traveling companion, his court recorder, a thin man named Gibbs, who said almost nothing but wrote everything and had hands that moved faster than seemed possible for their size. They came directly to Elias's ranch, as arranged in the second letter that had been exchanged through a postal route that bypassed Red Hollow's own post office. Hale was not what Elias had expected from his reputation, which was perhaps what the man intended. He was in his mid-50s, compact, with a neat gray beard, and the kind of stillness about him that didn't come from being relaxed, but from having trained himself not to waste motion. He had watchful eyes and hands that stayed folded on the table when he listened, which he did for 3 hours. Elias put the journal in front of him. Hale read in silence, turning pages with the same economy of motion that characterized everything else about him. Gibbs sat to his left with his own notebook and made occasional marks that Elias couldn't read. At one point, Hale stopped and went back several pages and read a section twice, and the only indication that anything he was reading affected him was the slight forward lean of his posture, the kind of lean that means this matters. When he finished, he looked up at Elias. 17 accounts, he said. 18, counting the former deputy. He's in Durant. He'll be here tomorrow morning. Hale's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A sharpening, an arrival at a conclusion. You've been building this alone. Mostly. For 14 months. Yes. Hale looked at the journal again. Not reading, just looking at it. You understand that the manner of presentation matters significantly. If this is done correctly, in a public and witness setting, the documentation is strong enough that Crow would have very limited recourse. That's my intention, public and witnessed. You're talking about doing this on the main street. Wednesday morning, Elias said, market day. The most people, the most witnesses. I stand in the center of town with the journal and I read from it, and I have each person named in it step forward to confirm what's written. Judge, he paused, and the weight of what he was about to say sat in him for a second before he let it out. I need you there in an official capacity, visible. If he can't contain it quietly, he needs to see immediately that the legal structure is already present. Hale looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Elias wondered, briefly, whether he'd miscalculated something, whether the judge was going to tell him that what he was describing was irregular, which it was, or impractical, or overly theatrical. Do you know what he'll do when he realizes what's happening? Hale asked. He'll try to stop it, Elias said. He'll make some kind of move, publicly. He paused. That's actually useful to us. A man demonstrating obstruction in front of a circuit judge and 36 witnesses makes a cleaner case than paper alone. Hale was quiet for another moment. Then, for the first time since he'd arrived, something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. You said you've been building this alone, Hale said. How many people are going to step into that street with you tomorrow? Elias thought about it honestly. I don't know exactly, he said. I know who I've asked. I don't know who'll come until they come. And if they don't? Then I stand there by myself with the journal, Elias said, and we see what that's worth. Hale looked at him steadily. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that means the decision has been made and there's nothing more to discuss about it. My recorder and I will be across the street. You'll know where to find me when you need me. He stood up. Elias stood up. They didn't shake hands. There was something about the gravity of what they'd just agreed to that made the handshake feel insufficient, and they both seemed to sense it, and they let the moment be what it was without adding ceremony to it. Gibbs closed his notebook. They slept in Elias's barn. Hale had refused the offer of the bed with a quiet wave, saying he'd slept in worse places, and the barn would do fine. Elias went back inside and stood in his kitchen for a while, not hungry, not tired, just present in his own house in a way that felt different from how he'd been present in it for a long time. He got a piece of paper and wrote 2 notes. The first to Vivian. Tomorrow morning, early. Bring your father. The second to Clara Dean, delivered by a boy he trusted to be discreet, with a $1 coin for his trouble. Wednesday. Main Street. Sunrise. Tell Tom Lester if you see him. He sent both notes and went to bed and lay there thinking about nothing in particular, which was either composure or the mind's way of protecting itself from a thing too big to think about directly. Morning came the way it always did on the plains. Without ceremony, without announcement, just the sky going from black to dark gray to a pale, flat light that arrived before the sun actually cleared the horizon. Elias was up before any of it. He put water on to boil and sat at the table and opened the journal one more time, not to read it, but to sit with it. The way you sit with something before carrying it into a situation where everything might go wrong. He could hear Hale moving in the barn. The judge was an early riser, apparently. At 6:30, Elias put on his coat, tucked the journal under his arm, and walked outside into the cold morning air. The sky was the color of pale pewter. His breath made small clouds. From the barn, Hale's horse made a sound, and Hale himself appeared in the doorway, already dressed, his gray beard neat, his hat straight. The two men looked at each other across the cold yard. "Ready?" Hale asked. Elias thought about Tom Lester picking at a splinter. Clara's careful letter, Pete Alderman saying whatever you need, Will Sayers riding south in the dark, Augustus Mercer sitting at this same table with his hat in his hands, Vivian with her hands around a chipped coffee cup, saying, "I came to you because you're the right one." "Yes," Elias said. They saddled their horses and rode toward Red Hollow in the early gray morning, side by side, the frozen grass crunching under the horses' hooves, the town appearing on the flat horizon the way it always did, small at first, a dark shape against the pale sky, then gradually resolving into buildings and light and the smoke from morning fires. Elias rode with the journal tucked under his arm and kept his eyes on the road ahead, and did not allow himself to think about anything that hadn't already been thought through. There was a kind of discipline in that, the discipline of a man who has done all the preparation that can be done and now has to trust it. The road was straight and the morning was cold, and Red Hollow was getting closer with every step the horses took, and whatever was going to happen next was going to happen whether Elias was ready or not. He had decided a long time ago that he was going to be ready. Red Hollow's main street on a Wednesday morning was never exactly quiet, but it had a particular rhythm to it. The feed store opening first, then the land office, then the general businesses coming to life in sequence like a row of lamps being lit one by one. Wagons arrived from the outlying ranches with the week's supply lists. Women moved between the dry goods and the post office. Men stood in loose clusters outside the feed store talking about weather and prices and the usual small arithmetic of frontier life. Elias rode in just after 7 and tied his horse at the rail in front of the hardware store, which was near the center of town and gave him a clear line of sight in both directions. Hale had peeled off 2 blocks back, taking the side road to come around to the far side of the street, where he and Gibbs would position themselves near the land office without drawing attention. They had agreed on this without discussing it much. The judge understood instinctively that arriving together would read wrong, would collapse the separation between the legal authority and the man invoking it in a way that could be used against them later. Elias stood on the boardwalk with the journal under his arm and looked at the street. It was on the surface an ordinary Wednesday morning in a small frontier town. A boy was sweeping the front steps of the barber shop. 2 women were talking outside the milliner's, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. A dog was sitting in the middle of the road with the relaxed authority of a dog that has decided the road belongs to it. He didn't see Vivian yet. He didn't see Tom Lester or Pete Alderman or Clara Dean. He didn't see Will Sayers, who should have ridden in from Durant before first light and was supposed to be waiting near the livery. What he saw, at the far end of the street near the county office, was Garrett Crow's horse tied out front, which meant Garrett was already in, which meant the morning had started. Elias took a breath of cold air and stepped off the boardwalk into the street. He walked to approximately the center of the main thoroughfare and stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene of it. He just stood there, still, in the middle of the street, and opened the journal. The first person to notice was the boy sweeping the barbershop steps. He stopped sweeping and watched. Then one of the women outside the milliner's turned, and then the other, and the conversation between them fell away. A man coming out of the feed store with a sack of grain over his shoulder paused on the steps and looked. Elias began to read. He read in a clear, carrying voice, not shouting, just projecting, the way a man speaks when he wants to be heard by everyone in a moderate-sized space and intends to be understood. He started with the first entry. Date, name, account. Rancher Hicks and the tax document altered without his signature. He read it plainly, without editorializing, just the facts as they had been told to him and recorded. The street was getting quieter. He read the second entry. Then the third. The accounts accumulated, names that the people of Red Hollow recognized, situations they had heard vague references to, things they had suspected or half known or told themselves weren't their business. Hearing them read aloud in sequence, in public, in the specific factual language of a man who had written things down carefully for 14 months, produced a particular effect that Elias had anticipated but couldn't have fully predicted. It made the invisible visible. It made the thing that had been happening in the town's peripheral vision suddenly central, suddenly undeniable, suddenly impossible to file away as someone else's problem. People were coming out of their buildings now. Not rushing. Nobody was rushing. Just drifting toward the sound the way people drift toward something they can feel matters, even before they understand exactly what it is. He was on the fifth entry when he heard the door of the county office open at the far end of the street. He didn't stop reading. Garrett Crow came out onto the boardwalk and stood there for a moment, taking in the scene with the expression of a man who has just encountered a situation he'd been told would not exist. He was in uniform today. His badge caught the weak morning sun. He looked at Elias standing in the middle of the street with the open journal, and he looked at the people gathered on either side, and something moved through his face that he brought under control very quickly, but not quickly enough that Elias, who had been watching for exactly that moment, didn't catch it. Fear. Just a flash of it. Then gone, replaced by the controlled, performative authority that was Garrett's primary instrument. He stepped off the boardwalk and began walking up the street toward Elias with his hands loose at his sides and his pace deliberately unhurried, broadcasting confidence. It was a good performance. Garrett had always been good at performances. "Boone," he said, pitching his voice to carry over the street noise, which had now dropped to almost nothing. "Whatever you think you're doing, I'm reading from a journal," Elias said. He didn't look up from the page. He kept reading. Garrett stopped about 20 feet away. He looked around at the gathered townspeople. A calculation, reading the room, deciding the best approach. He spread his hand slightly, an inclusive gesture, the sheriff including the townspeople in his reasonable concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is a man under a pending theft charge attempting to—" "November 4th, Elias said, his voice cutting cleanly through Garrett's. "Livestock taken from the Boone Ranch property, west pasture, fence, subsequently repaired to conceal entry. Witness account provided by Peter Alderman, whose property shares the adjacent fence line, and who observed 3 to 4 riders operating without lights between the hours of 11 at night and 2 in the morning. Pete Alderman stepped forward from the group on the left side of the street. He wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't say anything. He just moved out from the crowd and stood where he could be seen, his hat in his hands, his posture saying clearly, 'I'm here. I'm confirming it.' Garrett's eyes moved to Pete, and something in his expression recalibrated. Elias turned the page and kept reading. He read Clara Dean's account. Clara was standing near the schoolhouse end of the street. She had apparently come in early and positioned herself there. And when he read her name, she stepped forward the same way Pete had. No speech. Just presence. Just the statement of a person saying, 'Yes, this happened, and I will say so in front of anyone who asks.' He read Tom Lester's account of the water rights documentation that had been altered. Tom stepped out from the group on the right side of the street. He looked pale, and his hands were shaking slightly, which was honest. It was honest, and it was human, and nobody watching missed it, the cost of what he was doing visible in the way he held himself. Garrett had stopped walking. He was standing still in the middle of the street, 15 feet from Elias, and the distance between them had taken on the quality of a line drawn in the dirt. "This is—" Garrett started. "I'm not finished," Elias said. He read 3 more accounts. 3 more people stepped forward, including a woman in her 40s whose husband had been hit with a fabricated livestock violation 2 years ago and who had never said a word about it publicly until this moment. And when she stepped out from the crowd, she was crying. Not dramatically, not in a way she'd chosen, just the kind of tears that come when something you've carried alone for a long time is suddenly not alone anymore. Then Elias said, "I also have a statement from a former officer of this county." And Will Sayers walked out from the alley beside the livery. He was wearing clean clothes. He'd shaved. He walked to the center of the street and stopped beside Elias and looked directly at Garrett, and the look between the two of them contained a year and 2 months of distance and a door Will had quietly walked back through by showing up this morning. Garrett stared at him. Something happened in his face that went deeper than the calculated expressions he'd been managing. Something real, finally. The recognition of a particular kind of threat that he'd believed safely removed from the situation. "Will," he said. His voice had changed. Not much, but enough. "Sheriff," Sayers said. Garrett turned back to Elias. When he spoke again, the performance was back, but it had a crack running through it that he couldn't quite seal. "None of this is— you have no authority to conduct this kind of— this is not how the law works, Boone. You can't just stand in the street and—" "You're right," a new voice said. Judge Raymond Hale stepped off the boardwalk across the street and walked to the center. He was holding a leather case that contained his court credentials and his seal. He opened it as he walked and held it visible as he stopped. Conducting informal testimony on a public street is not a legal proceeding. However, witnessing a public statement of record in the presence of a circuit judge does carry weight in any subsequent formal proceeding. He looked at Garrett with the particular expression of a man who has seen many men in Garrett's position and has learned not to be moved by any of them. "And I am a circuit judge, Raymond Hale, 14th Circuit. Mr. Gibbs, are we recording?" From the boardwalk, Gibbs raised one hand without looking up from his notebook. Garrett Crow looked at Judge Hale. He looked at Will Sayers. He looked at the journal in Elias's hands and the people lining both sides of the street, the people who had stepped forward and the larger number who were simply standing there watching, and whose watching was itself a kind of statement, the statement of a crowd that has decided not to look away. When he spoke again, his voice was slower than before, measured. "Judge, with respect, I'm going to need you to understand that what you're seeing here is a coordinated attack on my authority by a man who is himself currently facing the theft warrant against Mr. Boone," Hale said, "which appears in the county records as filed by one Boyd Caswell. Mr. Caswell, are you present?" Silence. Boyd Caswell was not in the crowd, which was itself a kind of answer. Hale nodded slowly. "Mr. Boone, please continue." Elias turned to the final section of the journal. Not the last entry, but the section he'd written 3 weeks ago specifically for this moment, which was a summary account organizing the 17 individual records into a clear sequential narrative of Garrett's operation over the previous 4 years. He read it in the same level, carrying voice. It took 11 minutes. He knew because he'd timed himself reading it the night before. While he read, nobody in the crowd moved or spoke. He was aware of the quality of that silence. Not the silence of people waiting for something to happen, but the silence of people listening to something that was already happening, to which the appropriate response was to be still and hear all of it. Garrett made one more attempt. He took 3 steps toward Elias and said, in a low voice pitched more for Elias than for the crowd, "You stop now and this goes away. The warrant, all of it. I walked back to my office and this morning never happened." Elias looked at him over the journal. For the first time since he'd started reading, he paused. He looked at Garrett Crow, at the badge, at the hands that were not quite steady anymore, at the face of a man who had operated for years on the correct understanding that most people will choose not to fight because fighting costs too much, and who was now discovering that occasionally someone had spent their time differently and arrived at the fight with more than he'd expected. "You took 10 of my cattle," Elias said quietly. "You filed a false warrant with my name on it. You've been bleeding this town for 4 years. He closed the journal and held it at his side. "No, Garrett, it doesn't go away." He turned to Judge Hale. "I believe I'm finished," he said. Hale looked at Garrett. "Sheriff Crow, I'm initiating a formal review of the accounts presented this morning under my circuit authority. You are hereby requested to surrender your badge pending that review." He said it with the absolute impersonal calm of a man delivering a fact, not an opinion. "Deputy Holt, if you're present." Holt had been standing at the edge of the crowd for the past several minutes. He stepped forward. His face was complicated. A young man sorting through something difficult in real time. The shape of the institution he'd joined turning out to be different from the institution he'd thought he was joining. But he stepped forward. Garrett looked at Holt. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the judge and the recorder and Will Sayers and the open journal and the people who had stepped out of the crowd to stand in the street. He unpinned the badge himself, which was somehow more revealing than if Holt had taken it. The last performance. The maintenance of dignity in the form of controlling the manner of his own surrender. He set it in Holt's hand without speaking. Then he walked back toward the county office, and the crowd separated to let him through. And nobody said anything while he walked. Holt stood with the badge in his hand and looked at Elias, and then at Judge Hale, and then at the badge again, like a man who has just been handed an object significantly heavier than it looks. "What happens now?" Holt asked. He directed it at the judge, which was the right instinct. "Now," Hale said, "we do this properly. I'll need the use of the county building for the next several days. I'll need all records made available for review, and I'll need statements formally recorded from each individual who came forward this morning." He looked at Gibbs. We'll start this afternoon. Gibbs nodded and kept writing. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. That was the thing Elias noticed, standing in the middle of the street with the journal at his side, and the cold morning air around him, and the weak November sun now fully above the horizon. People didn't turn and go back to their businesses the way crowds usually did when the event was over. They stood there, some of them talking to each other, some of them quietly, some not talking at all. Tom Lester came and stood next to Elias without saying anything for a moment. His hands had stopped shaking. "I didn't know if I'd do it," Tom said finally. "When the moment came, I really didn't know." "You did it," Elias said. "Yeah." Tom looked down the street toward the county office, where Garrett had disappeared. "What's going to happen to him?" "That's up to the judge now." Tom nodded slowly. "Good," he said. And then after a pause, "I mean that seriously, that it's up to somebody who's supposed to decide it, that there's somebody like that." He seemed faintly surprised by his own sentiment, the way people are when a feeling arrives that they hadn't prepared for. Elias looked across the street and found Vivian. She was standing with her father near the edge of the crowd, and Augustus had his arm around her shoulders. Not a protective gesture exactly, more the gesture of a man steadying himself by holding on to the person nearest to him. Vivian was looking at Elias. She'd been looking at him, he realized, for a while. She wasn't smiling, which was right, because this wasn't a smiling kind of moment. What her face held was something more complicated and more genuine than a smile. The expression of a person who has reached the end of a thing they weren't sure they'd survive and is still figuring out how to exist on the other side of it. He walked across the street to them. Augustus extended his hand before Elias reached him, and Elias shook it, and the handshake went on longer than their first one had, which was the right amount of time for what it was sealing. "It's not finished," Elias said, because it was true and they needed to know it. "There'll be proceedings, formal statements. It'll take time." "I know," Augustus said. His voice was rough. "But today?" He stopped. He put his free hand briefly over his eyes, which was the gesture of a man controlling something he had not planned to feel in public, and then his hand came down and he was looking straight at Elias. "Today was a beginning." "Yes," Elias said. "It was." He looked at Vivian. She looked at him. Between them was a silence that was not uncomfortable, that held what it held without needing to be filled. Two people who had made a practical agreement that had turned into something neither of them had negotiated for, and neither of them was quite ready to name. "You all right?" he asked. She considered this with the same honesty she brought to everything. "Ask me again in a week," she said. He almost smiled at that. "Fair enough." Clara Dean appeared at his elbow. "The judge's recorder wants statements this afternoon." "What time?" 2 o'clock, Elias said. "Tell anyone who stepped forward. 2 o'clock at the county building." She nodded and went. Will Sayers appeared, and they shook hands without a lot of words because neither of them were men who used a lot of words when the situation had already said most of what needed to be said. Pete Alderman waved from across the street and Elias waved back. He stood there for a while in the winter morning, on the main street of Red Hollow, with the journal under his arm and the cold working its way through his coat and the town going slowly back to motion around him. Not the same motion as before, but motion nonetheless, the particular forward movement of a place that has just exhaled something it had been holding too long. He was tired. That was the honest thing. He was genuinely bone-deep tired in the way you get tired when you have been braced for a long time and have finally let yourself unclench. His left knee was throbbing. He needed coffee. He had not eaten since the previous evening, and his stomach was starting to make its opinion known about that. He was also aware, standing there in the weak November sun, that nothing about what had just happened was clean or finished or simple. Garrett would be charged, but charges took time. Records would be reviewed, but reviews took time. Boyd Caswell would have to be spoken to. The false warrant against Elias would have to be formally dismissed. Holt would have to navigate what remained of the county law office without the man who had been running it. All of that was ahead, and all of it was going to be tedious and procedural and would require him to be patient in the specific way that paperwork requires patience, which was different from the patience of fence work and far less satisfying. But the journal was public now. The accounts were on record. The judge had heard them, and his recorder had written them down. That part was done, and nothing Garrett Crow could do would undo it. Elias tucked the journal more firmly under his arm and started walking toward his horse. He had cattle to count. The formal proceedings took 11 days. That was 11 days of Elias riding into town in the morning and sitting in the county building while Judge Hale methodically worked through the record, calling witnesses, reviewing documents, cross-referencing the accounts in the journal against the county's own files, which Gibbs cataloged with the same inhuman speed he brought to everything. 11 days of testimony given in a small room with bad ventilation and 2 windows that let in inadequate light. Each person who had stepped forward on that Wednesday morning now required to say the same things again in the formal language of a legal proceeding, which was slower and more uncomfortable than saying them in the street had been, but which was also the thing that made them permanent. Garrett had retained a lawyer from the county seat, a man named Dodd, who wore expensive clothes and had the practiced manner of someone accustomed to making complicated things disappear. Dodd was good at his job. He found inconsistencies in the timeline of 2 accounts and exploited them with professional efficiency, and for 2 days of the proceedings, those inconsistencies cast enough shadow over the record that Elias sat in the back of the room and felt the cold, specific anxiety of a man watching something he built being tested for structural weakness. But Will Sayers' testimony was not inconsistent. Augustus Mercer's ledger was not inconsistent. And the shell account documents that Hale had subpoenaed from the county bank, records that Garrett's lawyer had apparently not anticipated Hale moving on so quickly, were precise and damning and left Dodd with very little to work with in the room's inadequate light. On the 8th day, Dodd stopped trying to find inconsistencies and started trying to negotiate terms, which was the moment Elias understood that the structural weakness he'd been worried about wasn't there. Garrett Crowe was formally charged on the 11th day. Extortion, abuse of official authority, falsification of county records, and conspiracy to commit theft. The last charge directly addressing Elias's 10 missing steers, for which Boyd Caswell had, under the weight of the proceedings, provided a statement that confirmed what Pete Alderman had seen from his porch. Caswell had not volunteered the information. He'd been asked directly, in a formal setting, with the judge's authority in the room, and the calculations that had led him to sign a false warrant in October turned out to be different calculations from the ones that applied here. He was pale when he gave the statement, and he didn't look at Elias when he left the room, which Elias understood and didn't hold against him. Caswell was a man who had been squeezed by the same machine as everyone else. He'd made a worse choice under that pressure than most, but the pressure was real. Garrett was remanded to the county seat pending trial. The morning they took him, a gray Thursday, the kind of day that had no weather to speak of, just cold and flat and still. Elias was standing outside the county building when the wagon came through. Garrett was in the back, hands bound in front of him, sitting straight because even now he couldn't stop performing. He saw Elias on the boardwalk as the wagon passed. They looked at each other. Garrett didn't say anything. Neither did Elias. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the public record, in 11 days of formal proceedings, in a journal that was now evidence. The wagon moved on down the street and turned north toward the county seat road, and Elias watched it until it was out of sight, and then he went inside and got his coat and rode home. The false theft warrant against Elias was formally dismissed on the same day Garrett was charged. Hale signed the dismissal himself and had Gibbs deliver a copy to Elias at the ranch, which was a courtesy that Elias recognized as such and appreciated without making a production of it. He put the dismissal in the box under his bed where the journal had lived for 14 months, and then he stood there for a moment looking at the box. And then he put the box up on the shelf where he could see it from the table, because it felt wrong to keep it hidden now that hiding things was over. Deputy Holt was appointed acting sheriff pending the county's selection of a permanent replacement. He came to Elias 2 days after Garrett left, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. Everyone, Elias had noticed, came to him with their hat in their hands these days, which was not something he'd asked for and wasn't entirely comfortable with, and asked if Elias had any recommendations for how to handle the transition period. Elias thought about it honestly. Talk to people, he said. Not about law, just talk to them. Most of what went wrong here started because the badge stopped being something people trusted and started being something they feared. The way back from that is slow. He paused. And if something doesn't feel right, write it down. Date it. Keep it somewhere. Holt looked at him for a moment. Like you did. Like I did. Holt nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. I heard you're getting married. That's the plan. Congratulations. He said it simply, without ceremony, which was the right way to say it. Then he got back on his horse and rode toward town. Elias watched him go and thought that Holt might turn out to be all right. Not perfect. Nobody was perfect at 26 or at any age for that matter, but all right. Trying, at least, which was more than the previous administration had managed. The wedding was on a Saturday in late November, 3 weeks after the proceedings closed. It was not an elaborate affair, which suited both of them. Vivian had been clear about that from their second or third conversation. She had no interest in a ceremony that was more performance than occasion, which Elias took to mean she'd been to too many weddings where the performance had been covering for a lack of occasion underneath. They were married at the county justice's office, which was a small room with a good window and a plant on the sill that was doing its best against the November light. Judge Hale had offered to perform the ceremony himself, which was an unexpected kindness, and Elias had said yes before thinking too much about it. The people who came were the people who had mattered through all of it. Clara Dean, in a green dress she'd clearly saved for occasions. Tom Lester and his wife, who cried, which Tom appeared both touched and slightly embarrassed by. Pete Alderman, who had cleaned up considerably and was still chewing on something. Will Sayers, who had driven down from Durant and would stay 2 days and then go back to his quiet plot with his chickens and his garden and the new, lighter way of carrying himself that had settled in since November. Augustus Mercer, who stood beside his daughter and managed to hold himself together until the moment Judge Hale asked if anyone present wished to affirm their support of this marriage, at which point Augustus said, "I do," in a voice that was not quite steady, and nobody in the room pretended not to notice. The ceremony was short. It was supposed to be short. Hale was efficient about it, the way he was efficient about everything, but there was a warmth in him that Elias hadn't fully seen during the proceedings. Or maybe it had been there and he'd been too focused to register it. When Hale pronounced them married and looked at the two of them with that quiet expression that sat somewhere between judicial and human, Elias thought that this was a man who had spent his career seeing the worst of what people did to each other and had somehow not let it make him mean about the rest of it. Vivian signed the register first, in her precise merchant's hand. Then Elias signed below her, in his less precise rancher's hand. And when he set down the pen and looked at his own signature next to hers on the page, he felt something that he couldn't have adequately named and didn't try to. They had supper at the Mercer house afterward, the good dining room, the table pulled out to its full length to accommodate everyone. A meal that Augustus had been quietly organizing for a week, and which was somewhat better than the occasion strictly required, which was exactly right. People ate and talked, and the conversation moved around the table in the way it moves when the people at the table have been through something real together, when the shared experience gives the ordinary small talk a quality of ease that you can't manufacture artificially. At one point, when the supper was winding down and people were pushing back from the table and the conversations had broken into smaller ones, Vivian leaned close to Elias and said quietly, "You doing all right?" He thought about it. "I keep waiting to feel like I know what comes next," he said. She looked at him. "And?" "Still waiting." She was quiet for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't quite seen her do before. She laughed. Not the controlled, social kind of laugh, but the actual kind. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine and doesn't worry about how it sounds. It was a good laugh. He stored the specific sound of it somewhere he didn't have a name for. "That's the most honest thing I've heard all week," she said. "I figured you'd appreciate that." She looked at him for another moment with something in her expression that had been building for weeks, probably, through all the conversations and the practicalities and the shared weight of a situation that had turned them from strangers into something that didn't have a clean category yet. There was a question in it, or not a question exactly, more an acknowledgement, that this was real, that they were actually here, that the practical agreement had held under pressure in a way that had revealed something underneath it, and that both of them could see the thing underneath and were going to have to figure out what to do with it. "We'll work it out," she said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, as a fact, without softening it into a sentiment. But this time the plainness of it was the warmth, not the absence of it. "Yes," Elias said, "we will." The guests left in the evening, one by one, and Augustus shook Elias's hand at the door again. They had shaken hands many times now, and each handshake had held something slightly different from the one before, and this one held something that Elias recognized as a rival, as the particular gravity of a man acknowledging that things had in fact turned out, which was not something Augustus had permitted himself to believe for quite some time. His eyes were tired, and the tiredness was clean, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from a long road finally ending. "You take care of her," Augustus said. It was half instruction and half something else, a father's translation of thank you into a language he could say without his voice giving way. "I intend to," Elias said. He and Vivian drove back to the ranch in the dark, side by side on the wagon bench, the horses moving at their own steady pace on the road they knew. The sky had cleared and the stars were out over the flat land, the kind of sky you only got out on the frontier, away from town light, where the stars went all the way to the horizon in every direction. Neither of them talked much. The silence between them was the kind of silence that two people arrive at when they have talked enough for one day, which was a different thing from having nothing to say. When the ranch came into view, the dark shape of the house and the barn against the star-bright sky, Vivian looked at it for a moment. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. "You've been here before." "I know. But it looks different now." She was quiet for a beat. "Different as in mine." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose it does." He had expected, maybe, some feeling of dramatic conclusion when they pulled up to the house. Some sense of an ending that was also a beginning, the way stories were supposed to work. But what he actually felt was more ordinary than that. The familiar weight of his coat, the cold air, the smell of his horses, the creak of the porch step that had needed fixing for 2 years and which he was now, suddenly, slightly embarrassed about. Ordinary life, recommencing. Which was, he thought, the point. That was actually the point. The days that followed were not transformed. They were just days. Good ones, mostly, with the particular texture of days spent learning how to share a space with another person after a long time of not doing that. There were adjustments. Vivian had opinions about where things should be kept that differed from Elias's long-established habits. He had a way of letting dishes sit that she found unreasonable. She worked in the evenings at a small desk she'd brought from her father's house, going through store accounts, and the lamplight from the desk filled the corner of the room in a way he hadn't expected to find as comforting as he did. They had arguments, small ones, but real ones, the kind of friction that comes from two people with fully formed habits trying to occupy the same life. Once, about 3 weeks in, a disagreement about a fence contract that Elias had made without consulting her escalated into something that surprised both of them with how much heat it generated. They said sharper things than they'd intended, and then they were both quiet for a while, and then Vivian said, "I'm not actually angry about the fence." "I know," Elias said. "I just—" She stopped, started again. "I've been managing things alone for a long time. My father's business, the situation with Garrett, all of it. Doing it alone was the only safe way to do it." She looked at her hands on the table. "I'm going to need time to learn to do it differently." He looked at her. "So will I," he said. "I've been by myself out here for 11 years. I've got habits you haven't even found yet." She made a sound that was somewhere between exasperation and a reluctant laugh. "That's not comforting." "It's not supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be honest." She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back at her. And they were two people who had chosen each other under pressure and were now discovering what that choice meant in ordinary time, which was different from crisis time, which had its own challenges that crisis didn't prepare you for. But the looking at each other had something in it that neither of them broke away from quickly, which was also something. They figured it out. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily. Garrett Crow's trial was held at the county seat in February. Elias and Vivian attended 2 days of it, along with Tom Lester and Will Sayers and Clara Dean. Boyd Caswell testified and kept his eyes on the floor when he did. Dodd made his arguments, and they were good arguments, technically, but they were arguments being made against a ledger and a journal and a former deputy and 11 named witnesses and the subpoenaed bank records. And good arguments couldn't change what those things said. Garrett was convicted on 4 of the 5 charges. The 5th, the conspiracy charge related to the cattle theft, was reduced rather than dismissed, which meant he didn't escape it. He received a sentence of 7 years, which Dodd immediately began appealing, which was his right. which would take years and would probably reduce the sentence somewhat in the end, because that was how the legal system worked when you could afford a man like Dodd. Elias had made peace with that possibility before the verdict came in, because the alternative to making peace with it was allowing his sense of justice to depend on an outcome he couldn't control, which was a bad arrangement for a person's peace of mind. What mattered was that the conviction existed, that it was on the public record, that 7 years or 5 years or 4, Garrett Crow was no longer in Red Hollow with a badge. On the drive back from the county seat, with the February landscape flat and brown around them and the wagon horses moving at their patient pace, Will Sayers rode alongside for a stretch. He was heading back to Durant from there. He'd sold the plot in the end, he mentioned, and was thinking about moving further west. "You ever figure out exactly why you started keeping the journal?" he asked Elias. It wasn't the kind of question Sayers asked often. He was a man who kept his interior life to himself mostly. Elias thought about it. "Not exactly," he said. "I think I just couldn't stand having the truth exist somewhere that nobody could see it." Sayers chewed on that for a while. "That's it," he said finally. "That's exactly it." He looked out at the landscape. "I should have started one of my own." "You weren't ready then," Elias said. "You came when you were." Sayers looked at him sideways. "You're more forgiving than I'd have expected from a man in your position." "I'm not particularly forgiving," Elias said. "I just think being angry at a man for being afraid when fear was the reasonable response is a waste of time." Sayers was quiet for a moment. "You know what the difference was between you and everybody else who saw what was happening and didn't do anything?" Elias waited. "You didn't wait for someone else to go first," Sayers said. "You just started, even when you didn't know what you were starting." He paused. "Most people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to go first." Elias didn't say anything. He thought about the first entry in the journal, a conversation over a fence post about a tax document written down in the evening because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be written down. No plan, no certainty about where it would lead, just the decision to keep a record of what was true, on the theory that truth written down was harder to lose than truth that existed only in the air. It hadn't felt like courage at the time. It had felt like a practical response to a situation that annoyed him, which was maybe how most courage actually felt from the inside. Less like something noble and more like stubbornness in service of something you couldn't stop caring about. Sayers peeled off north at the junction and lifted his hand in a wave without looking back. And Elias watched him go and thought that a man who could admit what Will Sayers had just admitted about himself was a man who would be all right wherever he ended up. Spring came to the ranch the way it always did, slow and muddy, and then suddenly, almost overnight, green. The pastures that had been brown and frozen through February and March turned over in April with the particular urgency of land that had been holding something in reserve. The cattle moved differently in spring, restless and purposeful, and Elias spent the first warm weeks doing the work he always did, fence checking, calving, the physical inventory of a working ranch reclaiming itself from winter. Vivian had taken over the household accounts and the correspondence with the supply contractors who served both the ranch and her father's store, and the efficiency with which she organized things that Elias had been managing imprecisely for years was impressive and occasionally humbling. She also, that spring, started coming out to the pastures in the evening sometimes, just to walk. And one evening in April she found him replacing a section of the south fence, the same south fence, always the south fence, and sat on the top rail and watched him work. "You're going to keep doing that until it's right," she said. "That's generally the approach, yes." "Has it ever been right?" He thought about it. There's always something. She looked out over the pasture. The sun was going down behind the hills, and the light was the good evening kind, warm and low, making everything look more considered than it actually was. He watched her watching it and thought about how 11 months ago she had ridden up his drive on a gray October morning, and he had been crouched behind this same barn with a pair of pliers 2 sizes too small for the job, and his life had looked like nothing was about to change. "Elias," she said. "Yeah, I'm glad I came here." She said it simply, without build-up, the way she said things that she meant. That morning, "I almost didn't." He set down his pliers. He turned and looked at her, sitting on the fence rail with the evening light behind her. "What stopped you from not?" She thought about it. "I couldn't figure out what the alternative was. Every option I ran through ended the same way, My father losing everything, and me having done nothing to stop it. She looked at him. But also, I think I'd watched you for a long time. Years, probably, without knowing I was watching you. The kind of watching you do when you trust something about a person, but don't have a word for what it is yet. He held her gaze. And now? Now I have a word for it. She didn't supply the word, which was fine. He didn't need it supplied. He understood what she meant the way you understand the things that matter most. Not through explanation, but through the accumulated weight of time spent close to something, learning its shape from the inside. He picked up his pliers and went back to the fence. She sat on the rail and watched the light change over the pasture, and neither of them needed to fill the evening with anything more than what it already contained. The ranch was not a changed place exactly. It was the same 600 acres of imperfect land that it had always been, with the same creaking porch step and the same south fence that always needed something, and the same cattle that had opinions about where they wanted to be that didn't always align with where he needed them. The house still had one window that let in pale light, and not much of it, and the table still had one leg shimmed up with a folded piece of leather, and the calendar on the wall was months behind because neither of them had gotten around to replacing it. But there were 2 coffee cups on the shelf now, instead of 1. There was lamplight from a desk in the corner of the evenings. There was the sound of another person moving through the house in the morning, the small, ordinary sounds of shared life that a person doesn't know they're missing until they're there. The journal still lived in the box on the shelf, next to the dismissal notice. Elias didn't read it often. It was a record of something finished, and finished things deserve to be left to rest. But sometimes in the evenings, when Vivian was at her desk and the lamp was burning and the ranch was quiet around them in the particular way that planes quiet in the dark, he'd look at the box and think about that first entry and the rainy October morning it had preceded and the long chain of small decisions that had led from one to the other. He didn't think of himself as someone who had done something extraordinary. He thought of himself as someone who had gotten annoyed at something that was wrong and had responded to it in the only way that made sense to him, carefully, patiently, with documentation. The fact that it had worked was partly planning, and partly other people's courage, and partly the timing of Raymond Hale's letter arriving when it did, and partly the kind of dumb luck that doesn't announce itself as luck until it's already happened. What he knew, sitting in his kitchen in the lamplight with the sound of his wife working in the corner and the journal on the shelf and the spring wind moving through the grass outside, was something simpler than any of that. He knew that the truth, kept carefully and long enough, had a weight to it that manufactured things didn't, that it accumulated, that it waited, and that sometimes, if you were patient and you didn't flinch, and you showed up on a cold November morning and stood in the middle of the street and opened the book, it was enough. He reached across the table and refilled his coffee, and the ranch settled around him in the dark, and the night went on.